Welcome, everyone. This is Rachel Richardson. I will be moderating the webinar today. I want to welcome you to our webinar entitled Propelling the MCBK Community Workgroup Launch. And just as a reminder, some housekeeping items here. Everybody should be muted, but I ask you to also mute your lines. We'll open up for discussion. At the end of the webinar, there will be time for questions and answers. So if you've got questions or comments, please do post them in the chat pod at any time, and we'll keep an ongoing log of them. Go ahead and send them to everyone, and we will take questions between speakers, a few questions for each of our presenters, and then we'll have time for general questions and answers and continued discussion at the end. And at that time, I can actually open mics and allow you to verbalize your comment, or I can read it through the chat if we have some issue with that. And then I'll remind anybody that uses Twitter, if you want to follow us or make comments on hashtag MobilizeCBK, that would be wonderful. So again, let me officially begin by again welcoming you to our webinar on the launch of the work groups for the MCBK community. My name is Rachel Richardson, and I am from Duke University, and also am acting as co-chair of the MCBK steering committee, along with Dr. Chuck Friedman from the University of Michigan. He and I both wish to welcome you to this webinar. He has a conflict and actually won't be able to join us today, but I know he's here in spirit and has certainly played a major role in putting this together. Our speakers today will be sharing experience from aspects of this community on specific topics that are organized into working groups, and we hope that this will be a call to action. And so at the end of this webinar, we'll give you information on how you can get involved and continue to participate in discussions and activities related to this. Our first speaker will be Dr. Bob Greenis, who's professor and Ira A. Fulton Chair in Biomedical Informatics at Arizona State University. Our second presenter will be Chris Schaefer, he's University Librarian and Assistant Vice Chancellor at the University of California at San Francisco. And we will also have Dr. Blackford Middleton, Chief Informatics and Innovation Officer from AppRevita Incorporated. And finally, we will have Jerry Perry, who's Associate Dean for the University of Arizona Libraries and Director of the University of Arizona Health Sciences Library. The structure for today, we'll begin with a little bit of background on what CBK is and what the Mobilizing CBK initiative is about. So I'll take just about 5 minutes to give some background and point you to additional resources if you want more background. And then I'll move it over to the presenters that I just announced. Each will represent one of the working groups in this effort and talk about activities to date and planned vision and future for those different work groups. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have a general question and answer session. So first, let me give a little bit of background on the concept of knowledge and computable biomedical knowledge. As many of you know, currently and historically, knowledge has been represented in human readable forms, words and pictures, and now even in videos. But the idea that libraries are holding knowledge in this format, but it's of limited value for people that want to apply it, particularly in machine or computer environments. So we see a future that involves computable or machine executable knowledge formats, and that we also see that libraries and other institutions are going to have a need to collect and support and manage digital knowledge objects in their holdings. So these knowledge objects we can see as part of the current knowledge infrastructure that we have. So we certainly see articles and knowledge continuing to proliferate in human readable forms, but that the knowledge that's encoded in these artifacts can also have an executable version, and that this knowledge object or computable code could also be stored in a library, if you will. And as we look at these machine executable knowledge objects that derive from traditional print publications and articles and practice guidelines and studies describing various types of analyses. We want to be sure that they can be fair. So just as we've seen the concept of fairness for data resources, we would like to expand that idea to the idea that knowledge objects could also be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we see a number of use cases in domains where having computable knowledge and fair computable knowledge will be essential. Certainly in the clinical domain, we can imagine clinical decision support objects in a number of formats that could be used to inform decisions of providers and patients, to evaluate treatments, and we can certainly imagine knowledge objects being useful for organizations to measure their performance. On the research end, really anything that's coming out of research in terms of analytic code and computable phenotypes could be reusable and could benefit others if it was in a format where they could easily access it and deploy it in their settings. In the public health arena, we can certainly see algorithms for event detection that, if accessible and interoperable, could be used more rapidly to detect events and deploy responses. In addition, we could imagine that computable knowledge objects could support behavior change and chronic disease management in a number of settings, even beyond traditional healthcare settings. And as we move into the world of big data and analytics, we see a number of use cases around education and sharing knowledge objects to support training and competencies in various types of analytics, as well as training for healthcare workers to function in big data in knowledge-intensive environments. So for those of you that aren't aware, we had our first public meeting of the MCBK, which is Mobilizing Computable Biomedical Knowledge community, in July of 2018. It was hosted by the National Library of Medicine. We met at the Lister Hill Center. We had 150 participants from a variety of fields, including all those stakeholder groups that I mentioned in my previous slide, and had a fair amount of time for breakout sessions and discussion, and much of that content is what will be presented today. So information about this meeting, including videos and transcripts, is on our web page, which is www.mobilizecbk.org. That open meeting was centered around a manifesto that was developed by our steering committee for the effort, as well as participants in that meeting. So prior to the meeting, all registrants were given a copy of a draft manifesto, and it was edited, and then there was discussion about this at the meeting. Then after the meeting, there was even a public comment on this, and the current version is on our website, www.mobilizecbk.org. And the manifesto really provides a common ground of this sort of definition of computable biomedical knowledge, but some shared principles and values that give us a starting point for taking CBK, mobilizing it, and our interest in making it fair, as I mentioned earlier. And the outcomes of the July meeting, which bring us here today, were that of those 150 stakeholders, there was an enthusiasm to continue to advance this MCBK effort and agenda, primarily through 4 theme-based work groups, which we'll be presenting today. It was also recommended that we develop some sort of supportive infrastructure just to logistically keep this moving. And so the University of Michigan has offered to provide those resources for us, and we're grateful for that. So we have a website and communication list that many of you are a part of, and if you're not, I will encourage you to sign up at the end of this webinar. We thought it would be helpful to create a webinar series, and so this is the second webinar. There's one that's archived on the website that talks about the MCBK movement more generally. So I encourage you to view that or read the summary notes if you're interested. There's a plan for a second meeting, and I'll give details of that at the end, but that will be in July of 2019. And that there would be an interim governance, which would be the planning committee for that last public meeting has moved to become a steering committee. And then, as I mentioned, University of Michigan is providing some basic resources to keep us functioning. So we have the 4 different work groups that are part of this effort. There's the standards for MCBK work group, the technical infrastructure, policy and coordination to ensure quality and trust, and sustainability for mobilization and inclusion. And each of these 4 work groups is advancing part of the agenda, and I will have a representative from each of these groups talk for a few minutes about their vision and activities, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions for each of the work group chairs, and then a more general discussion afterwards. So as I mentioned, Bob Greenis is the co-chair for the Standards Working Group. Leslie McIntosh and Chris Schaefer are the leads for the Technical Infrastructure Group. And Leslie is the Executive Director of the Research Data Alliance. The Policy and Coordination to Ensure Quality and Trust group is led by Blackford Middleton, who will be presenting on behalf of himself and Jody Platt, who is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan Learning Health Systems Department. And the Sustainability for Mobilization and Inclusion is led by Chris Dimmick from the Agency for Healthcare, AHRQ, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and Jerry Perry, as I mentioned, from the University of Arizona. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Greenis, who will talk for a few minutes about the Standards Working Group. And I will mention that each of these working groups does have a liaison in the Internal Planning Committee, just to make sure that we've got some consistency and communication across groups. So Alan Flynn works closely with Bob on the Standards Group. So Bob, if you want to say a few words, and I can advance your slides as you need.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So welcome. Looks like we have a good crowd here. So the Standards Work Group, we're trying to basically come up with general principles that cut across all the different kinds of knowledge and all the different use cases. So we're starting with kind of a framework, and one of them is how one characterizes CBK itself, and that's largely in terms of structured metadata. And when we think about how one locates resources to use, or even uses context-based situational cues to pull up knowledge automatically, those axes are very important. And we obviously need to cut across domains and types of use. So Rachel mentioned the different kinds of uses, ranging from clinical care to research to population and et cetera. So how we do this is, it's a broad task. And the details, the more fine-grained we can be, the more specific resources can be located. So that could mean the clinical scenario, for example, that something is needed in, and the type of action that is related, like medication prescribing or lab test ordering, or similarly in any other domain, the more specific sub-question or sub-task that the knowledge is aimed at supporting. So that task is a broad one, and what we want to do first is to come up with a set of metadata axes that make sense. And to do that, and also to begin to build knowledge resources, we want to drive that not by trying to do a top-down approach, but rather developing a set of spanning use cases that will start out with high-priority ones and then gradually expand. And then the ways in which knowledge is needed to be shared and interoperable in those scenarios. And then as we do that, we will then try to develop standard knowledge representations for each type of knowledge. Now, when I say develop, we will work, as I'll mention in the next slide, with other organizations. Why don't we advance to the next slide? So our first task, which is partly why we're having this webinar, is to recruit key stakeholders to the work group. And as we do that, we want to identify priority use cases for usable knowledge, and the stakeholders that participate are the ones that are going to help decide what the priority is. So we want a constituency that's committed to working on the task of standardization, and we also want to pick use cases where there's a demonstrated need, a constituency that's actually going to require or need the product of this work. So we don't want just the developers, but we want the users or consumers of it as well. An example would be a clinical use case to reduce workflow inadequacies or whatever. Or there might be one in research connecting genomics and pharmacogenomics, whatever it might be. But we need to have constituencies that both want to develop it and also want to use it. For those, we will then work on developing the candidate metadata axes. And we'll generally try to, when we develop an axis, like a purpose for the knowledge, want to think broadly, so not just the use case, but other generalizations of it. We're also, as I mentioned, not really going to develop the knowledge representations in models themselves, where we can leverage work of HL7, OMG, or a host of other standard development initiatives trying to formalize the ways that knowledge is being used in a variety of domains and with a variety of organizations. So we want to coordinate with them and not reinvent the wheel. And we also, through our work, want to contribute to their ongoing work. Then as we do that, we will develop or establish, I keep saying develop, but I'm also saying we're not to develop, candidate knowledge representations, and then repeat. The whole process, continues with next priority items as we go on. So that's the model. And let's go to the next slide. So I expect the work group will evolve, and we've had a lot of discussions, for example, for the leadership of it, because we really want to maintain a broad perspective. We don't want to kind of focus in too much on one aspect like vocabulary or decision rules or whatever, but rather to kind of come up with a broad framework. So metadata, representation formalisms for those that we pick, but also how does one package the knowledge and the supporting information and to embody the FAIR principles that we've talked about. So we need input from this and maybe broader community that's not on this call, and mainly to decide on priorities and to also establish a leadership team. We have more than 2 co-chairs. We could have, as HO7 does, sometimes 3 or 4 for our work group. But we want to make sure that the different foci and kind of perspectives are represented in the leadership with knowledge and commitment to work on it. And so they need to be familiar with ongoing standards efforts and have sufficient time and energy to commit. So that's kind of, and right now, Alan and Rachel have been helping a lot in this work group because it really is kind of pivotal to how we proceed. And so we have kind of held off yet on trying to fill that second slot. Alan or Rachel, anything to add?
No, I think that's a great summary of what really is a challenging work group because there's so much that could possibly go into this. I'll encourage people on the call to send messages or questions through the chat to everybody if you've got something specific in terms of a comment or question for Bob or I with the standards group. And while we're waiting, I will just ask Bob if you sort of summarize your perspective on how we've decided to focus this initial effort so that we don't get carried away in all different directions or have just a huge scope. How would you describe that we sort of decided to focus this so that we could be productive in the short term?
Well, I think the first thing is to find out, other than maybe the 3 of us, who else is going to be involved and start convening an initial meeting or teleconference so we can begin to identify what the priority use cases are. But we really need, we had a whole list of people that have are on the mailing list for the standards work group. We don't know who is actually going to commit effort to it. So I'd like to see over the next month or whatever timeline. I don't know how you're actually going to orchestrate responses to this to actually formalize the work groups, but I'd like to see some indication by email back to me or to Rachel or anybody else, some interest in participating in it. But that's my near-term priority. I don't know how else, other than to have a working group, that we can actually make progress on these.
Yeah, that's great. And I will just summarize from our July meeting, there were a number of people that were very interested in this group, representing very different perspectives. So it is a challenge to unite everybody to work toward some common tasks that'll move us on this agenda, and I think we're well on our way. We'll follow up afterwards for people that are not yet part of that group, but sign up today as interested in that with communications for how we can move forward. We do have a couple of questions that we could address quickly before we move to other groups. One from Maria Michaels: how will you use or incorporate existing efforts that are working towards many of the same goals of MCBK? That might be a general question, but Bob, I don't know if you want to reiterate what you said earlier about our desire to not to reinvent the wheel and to be complementary to existing efforts.
Yeah, I don't know that it needs reiteration. I think we've said that. We don't have the manpower or the resources to do that, and it would be silly to do it because, anything we develop the we has to be the broader community. And so we have to work with groups that care about these things.
Terrific, thank you. The other question was what would be the use cases, and I think I'll jump in that as we're getting ready to move forward to our next group and say again that, as you said before, these would really need to come from our community, our constituents and people. So we welcome people to bring very specific use cases to us, not just for the standards groups, but the other groups, as you'll see, that also rely on use cases to work through some of the very important issues here. With that, I'd like to turn it over now to Chris Schaefer, who will talk about the technical infrastructure working group. Chris?
Hi, so just checking to make sure you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. So along with Leslie, I'm co-chairing this group, and Peter is our liaison at the University of Michigan. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the infrastructure group, or technical infrastructure group, is going to be charged to identify and describe the landscape of infrastructure stakeholders. We think that there are a lot of stakeholders related to infrastructure in this environment, some of which might not be as obvious as others. So identifying who those various people are is going to be a key part of what we want to do. We also want to describe the components to move CBK from generation into practice, and you see we've got testing, versioning, use, evaluation. So looking at the entire pipeline of CBK from start to finish and thinking about what components, what frameworks are necessary in order for those various activities to be successful. What do we need to do in order to facilitate the activities of CBK in a way that presents carrots rather than sticks, that overcomes barriers rather than creating them. We also, and this is in response to the question from, I think it's Gunis Koro in the chat, we want to develop use cases that connect stakeholders to the framework components. And in particular, we would really like to identify use cases that are actually in implementation now or being planned for implementation, so that we can think about those and learn from them as we go along. And finally, we want to act as a clearinghouse for all the infrastructure stakeholders and the MCBK community. And that's going to be an interesting challenge because we want to communicate both with people who are involved in this group directly, but also with stakeholders who are peripherally involved but very important to the success of CBK. And finding ways to reach out to those communities and engage with them is going to be quite an interesting challenge. We can go ahead to the next slide now. Okay, so we've generated an initial list of potential stakeholders, and you see on here that there are the obvious ones: clinical researchers and providers, informatics leaders, but others that might not be quite so obvious, like patient organizations or insurance companies, and certainly IT and compliance and security people. So we think that it's going to be important to look at each of these stakeholder groups and figure out what it is that where they engage with CBK, where they engage with the infrastructure that supports CBK, and what their role is and what their perspectives are. Because we think that engaging on the infrastructure level is in some ways very similar to the engagements that are going to be explored by the other three groups here that are presenting along with us. But in some ways, there's going to be unique challenges to infrastructure development and infrastructure understanding that will be specific to the technical infrastructure group that we'll have to articulate and bring to the table so that we don't inadvertently build systems that fail to take into account, for example, compliance issues. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Along with this, and this echoes back to another previous question, we definitely want to engage with complementary efforts. We understand that this is a big challenge and that there's a lot of work to be done, and we certainly don't want to compete with these other efforts, and this is just a sampling of groups like RDA and GA4GH that we think will be important to engage with. We don't want to duplicate their efforts, but we also want to partner with them wherever possible in order to leverage the larger community beyond the particular people who are involved in this group. Because a lot of the infrastructure challenges that we're going to be facing are the same ones that are being explored by these groups, but also there are other infrastructure issues that are being explored to solve other problems that we may be able to leverage in CBK. And in particular, we want to work with these groups to identify what is it that makes it hard for people to implement CBK right now, and ask the question, how can we make everything easier? How can we reduce barriers? How can we move on? And so some of our initial activities we're starting to draft a list of initial activities, and one of our hopes is that some of you will join us in developing a list of stakeholders and exploring it, developing the list of complementary efforts, but also in identifying our initial activities. So creating the stakeholder list and identifying their interests and identifying their primary interests will be important. We want to create a list of potential webinar topics to see what rises to the top to interest the stakeholder communities that we want to engage with. Echoing back to what Bob said a moment ago, we want to compile lists of CBK resources and use cases and identify ways to make them fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And finally, we want to describe some specific adoption cases. We don't really want this to be an exercise in what-ifs or theoreticals. We want to find some actual use cases, whether they're being implemented right now or planned for implementation, or whether we can spur their implementation. But we want to watch what people are doing as they actually do this work, learn from it, and feed it back into the framework. We want to be very pragmatic and practical in finding ways to make the MCBK movement a reality that people can engage with and say, oh yeah, there's an example of how this works in practice. There's a health system or a learning health system that's actually implemented something along these lines. There's an implementation that's really of interest to patient organizations or insurance companies and so forth. So if we move on to the next slide, I think that wraps it up, and I would just ask if either Peter or Leslie have anything to add or any additional comments they want to make.
I think you did a great job of summarizing. We do have a couple of questions in the chat to answer, such as how much of this project will involve building infrastructure and developing standards as opposed to cataloging and helping coordinate existing efforts?
Yeah, that's a really big challenge. I suspect that we're going to be doing more on the latter side, coordinating efforts and promoting people rather than actually building physical infrastructure. Developing standards is a question for the standards group, but again, I think that cataloging and organizing is more in line with what I see as the potential there. We don't have a big grant to pay for us to build infrastructure at the moment. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on that question.
Great. I think we'll save the broader aspect of that, and also Musimi's question about coordinating the track. We'll save that for the end session. I will mention that Blackford Middleton and Maria Michaels from Centers for Disease Control are in the pod sharing some resources that might be of interest. The CDC has a request for information for National Testbed Collaborative effort. And so this is just the kind of thing that we do like to hear and want to hear from the community, or what are relevant efforts and initiatives that we can plug into. So we'll keep note of these, and we will pass the note. We will answer the questions after the webinar, even if we don't get to them all here. I don't think there's anything specific for technical infrastructure. Unless I'm looking right now if a new one came in, and we will send the PowerPoints after the meeting if people are interested. Chris or Leslie, could you just share for a moment what makes it hard for people to implement CBK right now, and what kind of infrastructure or features we might need to make that easy?
I think probably the biggest challenge right now is lack of coordination across all the stakeholder communities. Everybody's doing their little piece to a certain extent in isolation, and one of the goals of this effort is to bring these communities together to see where there are patterns and things that are overlapping interests, and identify ways to encourage people to work together in those areas rather than to work in silos. I think another big challenge is the issue of the use cases, and finding actual use cases that we can point to and say, this is what we mean when we're talking about doing this work, and so that we can identify areas where there's actual boots on the ground work being done, that we can both put up as exemplars, but also examine and learn from the success and failures of those efforts.
And to echo that, I mean, we really are looking at this as this would also provide a gap analysis for us to understand where would there need to be perhaps changes in technical infrastructures that we can't right now foresee in the Mobilizing CBK movement.
Yeah, and I think this goes to Blackford Middleton's comment in the chat that we have to engage with the EHR knowledge vendors and knowledge service vendors who are actually implementing CBK, and so that takes us out of the academic community and into the commercialization world, which is challenging for some of us.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. With that segue, I'll move now to the policy and coordination to ensure quality and trust. And Blackford is presenting for that group. Blackford, are you online?
I am on. Can you hear me okay, Rachel?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on the call with so many friends and colleagues about such an important topic. Next slide, please. Jody Platt, I think, can be with us for the next 15 minutes or so, so I'm going to endeavor to be quick and make sure she has a chance to correct anything I say. The Policy and Coordination to Ensure Quality and Trust group had its first breakout in the July meeting, and in that breakout we talked about a lot of the issues that to date have been largely under-addressed, frankly, in the way that we deal with knowledge artifacts, or payloads as they may be called, to allow us to mobilize, share, and implement decision support or quality measures and other knowledge artifacts beyond the clinical domain in a way that leads to high trust, high reliability, and performance. In that breakout, we talked about a whole host of different components, various characteristics of trust, as well as challenges that need to be addressed to coordinate and the characters that might be engaged. And thus, I think, was born this policy and coordination work group to ensure quality and trust. Next. We have the good fortune, however, of leveraging a lot of work that has been done in the same vein at the AHRQ-funded Patient-Centered Clinical Decision Support Learning Network, where both Jody and I had the good fortune of co-chairing a committee with Josh Richardson and Barry Blumenfeld that was looking at developing a trust framework, in fact, for knowledge artifacts. And that produced a white paper, which I'll be sure to share with anyone interested in this work group. And there's a manuscript that has been submitted, I'm happy to say. But I think we can start with that work and extend it further to actually build out some of the ideas in this work group with the following kind of charter. And this is preliminary, not yet vetted at all with the work group per se. We think that first we should identify and address gaps in policy and issues that would impact the quality of data and knowledge or its trustworthiness. This is a slightly different angle than what's gone before. Again, things like GLIA, the Guideline Implementability Assessment Tool, or the Guides Checklist, which recently came out, look at different dimensions of how we translate and specify and implement knowledge into an operational context, whichever kind it may be, research or clinical or public health or other. But we don't really have tools and methods yet to assess these. So we want to build upon the prior effort and coordinate efforts to apply, evaluate, and build upon that trust framework that then could perhaps be used to build some tooling. For example, to be very action-focused and try to build some tools that we can test, implement, and evaluate and iterate upon. These tools, measures, and perhaps metrics of a variety of kinds would try to ensure robust and unbiased methods to support transparency in knowledge creation and implementation and use, fairness principles, and the currency, validity, and provenance of CBK, and would dovetail, I think, in a very intimate way, if you will, with the standards effort and the infrastructure effort that we've already heard about and all of the work groups in toto. Next. So we, of course, want to convene the best and the brightest and get launched in a working way with that work group to perhaps look at a couple of opportunities. One is the idea of a product information label. I'll give credit to the CDS Connect project for first coming up with this idea, but what might be the set of attributes that could be quantified or qualitatively assessed to give a user of a knowledge artifact trust in its whole life cycle, provenance, and governance methods, what have you. We'd like to build and test some model governance structures. The PC-CDS Learning Network also looked at this problem to a certain degree and developed something called the Analytic Framework of Action, which I think we can also input here. But what might be both local, institutional, or organizational, or IDN level, as well as national level governance structures that help us to determine what is the most high priority evidence, for example, from PCOR research that needs to be translated into practice. And then, of course, work with the other members of the other work groups in the MCBK and the community at large to develop these ideas, test, and refine. Next. Let me give Jody a chance to jump in, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a good summary, and I think just to reiterate that we have a lot of good work to be building off of, both from the July meeting and then the trust framework group that you were talking about earlier. And it's, I think, a great opportunity to begin to catalyze that into actionable, measured governance policy change.
Terrific. Thank you both so much. This is Rachel. I don't see anything specific to your group, but rather general questions. But I was wondering if the idea of usability and usability testing sort of falls within the purview of this group or has entered your earlier discussions. And also, could you describe the type of person or stakeholder that you would like to be a part of your work? Are you people specifically with policy experience, or are you looking more broadly?
To the first question, Rachel, I'll give a crack at it. You know, usability, I think, is perhaps a concern more of the technical work group or infrastructure work group, of course, and vendors themselves. We didn't see that as a main focus area for us, but certainly we could take that into consideration. Secondly, with respect to who are the ideal members for this team. In the Learning Network Trust Framework document, we identified 9 actors. That includes everybody basically involved at any point in the creation of a knowledge artifact, its translation, implementation, specification, the knowledge curators, the IT vendors, the EHR vendors, knowledge services, knowledge providers, end users, and the patient, him or herself, who are all impacted about whether or not these artifacts, payloads are working correctly and whether or not they're trustworthy.
There's some comments popping up right now about privacy and security, both as topics to engage with and possible stakeholder groups. And I think it was perhaps underemphasized in the presentation, but is a key component to anything related to trust as sort of a risk mitigator.
Great, thank you. And just to remind everybody, we will go through and address the questions and provide written answers to those. And we are taking note of all the chatter and the resources that are coming up in the chat pod. So thank you for doing that, and please continue. Next, I want to move to the Sustainability for Mobilization and Inclusion work group, and I will turn it over to Jerry Perry, will present on behalf of his leadership team.
Thank you, Rachel. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
And Rachel, thank you for those terrific pictures. That's really great. If you could advance the slide, that would be great. So coming as sort of the last of the work groups to present, I think folks participating today are going to start hearing some echoes. Just as Bob presented first, we are interested, of course, in recruiting stakeholders and other individuals to the work of our group, and thus the description of the nature of the work that we're going to be focusing on. And just as the folks in the policy group were just discussing, our work is largely anchored in the discovery process that occurred during the July 2018 meeting that we had in Bethesda. So at that meeting, we really, as a Sustainability and Mobilization for Inclusion group, focused on getting energized around promoting the movement of CBK, where mobilizing is really the key word. And we saw as a critical piece in all of this the need to articulate the value proposition. I think we've heard a little bit about that as we've talked about the relevance, the resonance of the various use cases, and I think that that's one of the roles for the Sustainability and Inclusion group to focus on in terms of stating and clearly articulating that value proposition piece. When our group gathered, we broke into teams and started focusing really on what the stakeholders might be interested in terms of engaging with and understanding and appreciating their perspective around the value, trying to put ourselves, in other words, in their shoes and to understand what their workflows are, what their concerns and interests might be. And when we considered those groups, we identified knowledge creators as a constituency. We talked about hosts, disseminators, and developers as an additional group. And we also focused a little bit on the knowledge consumers as a critical component to this work. Folks might know that we had a 2-day meeting when we were in Bethesda, and our second day we had an opportunity to start thinking more intensely about and doing a deeper dive into that value proposition component. Next slide. So coming from this, we have developed what we're calling a charter. The charter is an articulation of our purpose and the work and the nature of the kind of work that we intend to be doing. We seek to mobilize the diverse stakeholders that we see in the community of practice, and we would like to engage them in an ongoing and very active engagement and conversation about the value proposition of CBK. We would like to focus our communications and engagement in a way that establishes an equitable and fair CBK ecosystem. It's important to us that we have those values articulated and continue to promote them. We also seek to have engagement through various active channels that make sense to the recipients of the information. Again, wanting to be where our community and our stakeholders are at. When we think about creator communities, here we're echoing a little bit of what I think Chris Schaefer mentioned earlier today. We're thinking about creator communities that include professional societies, associations, accrediting bodies, entrepreneurs, businesses, individuals who are generating the content. We're also talking about hosting and dissemination communities, and that includes publishers, libraries, a community with which I emerge from and am familiar with, but also commercial brokerages and other entities in that space. We also have an interest in the consumer communities, which we think sometimes get overlooked in this space. And that includes, of course, healthcare providers. They don't necessarily get overlooked, or clinical care delivery systems. But when we start thinking about consumer advocacy organizations, community-based groups, individuals who are engaged in the healthcare status of individuals and populations and advocate for those communities, we'd really like to bring their voice to the table as well in these conversations. And we're also thinking about the funding communities. And, of course, that includes the federal government, charitable organizations, philanthropy, association-based organizations that do for-benefit work, entities that really support innovation and equity in healthcare, we think are really a critical constituency for us. So as we thought about the purpose of our particular work group, we really do want to focus on that mobilization of these diverse stakeholders and their voices. We want to focus on the value proposition. We have as a goal the creation and perpetuation of a resilient, robust CBK ecosystem. We like that idea of the ecosystem because of its largesse in terms of diversity and inclusion, a critical component to us. We want to encourage public-private partnerships. We want to support those open standards as we think about what standards we do develop. We want to generate value for users and have that be explicable. And we also want to engender equity in this experience. And so as the group that's largely focused on communications and engagement, we're largely interested in the messaging piece. And so as we've started to articulate what some of our goals might be, we are focusing pretty significantly, I think, in the messaging component or the marketing piece. Among those things, we want to engage with and identify stakeholders from the diverse community. So the work that Chris Schaefer mentioned before about identifying stakeholders, we see ourselves as having a role in helping to amplify that. We want to use communications and marketing to build momentum, as we think that that's an important component of any communication strategy. We want to discern where there may be vulnerabilities or gaps in terms of knowledge about CBK and the communication tools that we're using so we can accelerate access to information about this. We'd like to be engaged in investigating and prioritizing opportunities for collaboration that exists with current networks and communities as resources in this space. Again, we're talking about an ecosystem, so we want to support this holistically. It all centers, I suspect, around the value proposition, so that will be an important piece. And then something about which I'm very passionate personally is we also want to engage in some consciousness raising in order to make sure that the CBK assets that we engage with or that we promote and encourage in terms of their development, that those assets don't inadvertently or intentionally, of course we don't want that, but that they don't inadvertently perpetuate discrimination or bias in terms of the way that they are created or used. In other words, we don't want to see there have adverse impacts or the exclusion of populations based upon the use of these technologies. I think with that I'm going to stop and ask my colleague, Chris Demick, to see if she has any thoughts to share. Oops, I have another slide. I apologize. Our next steps are obviously to socialize our draft charter with workgroup members, circling back to Bob's comment about recruiting to our members. And we will want to revise our work based upon our workgroup feedback. Now, Chris, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Thanks, Jerry. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Great. So some of us were talking the other day about how policymakers aren't exactly having a great hue and cry for CBK work. So I just want to add that we're hoping through the work that the Sustainability, Promobility, and Inclusion Work Group can do will create that hue and cry on the part of policymakers to conduct CBK work. Thanks, Jerry.
Oh, it's an awesome comment. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thank you both. This is a really exciting work group, and you've got certainly a large space and a large variety of stakeholders and diverse group to try and engage. Have you thought about any specific strategies to engage different associations or societies and their agendas so that they can see our shared interests and disseminate this work about mobilizing computable biomedical knowledge?
Sure. Well, one thought that I've had, Rachel, is I've been working very closely with the Association of Academic Health Sciences Libraries, and I've been leveraging, frankly, my board representation. I'm a member of the board of that group to bring forth an interest in this particular topic. I think it may not be obvious to some of my partners and colleagues within the library sciences community what their roles might be or their interests might be, but I see them as being many and critical. Thus, Chris Schaefer's participation, others in our community of interest being involved in the first public meeting. I do think it will be really helpful and important for us to leverage existing networks. And to me, that largely includes associations and societies. And we have a responsibility, I think, to create collateral that markets and promotes the different ways that we can be engaged in this space. And I'm hoping also that that includes some teaching and learning opportunities, since many of us reside in the academy, and the teaching learning mission is really close to our hearts and is really a lot about what we're about. So leveraging the example that I mentioned earlier around the Oswald Group, Association of Academic Health Sciences Libraries, trying to get programming within our space that surfaces CBK and talks about the value proposition, I think will be an important strategy that we can use. If we can create collateral in the form of digital learning objects that can be shared, I don't mean that ironically, but that can be shared in various communities of interest, especially those for whom the relevancy, their immediacy may not be immediately clear. I think that provides a great opportunity. Is this answering or addressing the question, Rachel?
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. And with that, I encourage people to continue to put questions in the chat pod. If we don't get to all of them, we'll, as I mentioned, provide written responses and share those on the website. I'm going to just give some instructions, and the next set of questions I'll share sort of cross groups. So I'm going to open it up to any of the presenters and co-chairs today to comment on. I will say this for those of you that are on the call: if you attended the July meeting and were a part of a work group, then we still consider you part of that work group and you're on our listservs for that. So you will get communications, and we encourage you to be involved. For those of you that haven't signed up yet, there's a link in the chat pod and also on screen here that you can sign up, and it'll bring you to a quick survey, and you can pick a work group and get on the mailing list and engage that way. So we encourage you to do that, and hope that this description of the groups and their activities appeals to you, and you'll choose one or more groups that you want to engage in. Information on the manifesto, background about the meeting, and anything we discussed today is available on the website. And again, here's the links for the survey. We encourage you to keep your eye out for future webinars and to plan to attend the next MCBK meeting, which is July 18th and 19th of 2019 at NLM, and details will be provided later. With that, let me move to a couple of questions at cross groups, and the first was from Mosumi Sengupta, who asked how the tracks will be merged. And I'll take that question and then move to another. As you can see, there's a lot of potential overlap, but I'd like to consider that really synergy across these groups. And so we have the 4 working groups, each with a set of co-chairs and a liaison from our internal planning committee that also liaisons with the steering committee. And all the co-chairs are part of a broader steering committee, and we have folks represented from a variety of disciplines and perspectives on that. And so our goal is, at least at this point, while we've got 4 groups and we're trying to manage these communications centrally, that we can make sure that we're co-evolving nicely, and certainly that structure and the number and types of groups could very well change over time. But we've at least got a plan for the short term to sort of coordinate these groups, but we do expect synergy and crosstalk between the groups. Another question that came up Siegfried Gold asked about the boundaries of what is meant by knowledge and knowledge artifacts, and I do want to just reiterate that we're talking about computable or executable kind of knowledge. So we're not talking about data or specific data types or protocols or sort of electronic versions of paper documents, but rather things that are executable. So the electronic phenotypes could fit into that category, and I could see algorithms, and that is sort of one activity that the standards group had looked at, sort of how to catalog these. I do want to go, we've got just a few more minutes, and there was a very interesting question from Sarah Corley that I wonder if we could either unmute her, and I'll invite any of the co-chairs to respond. Sarah, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very concerned that the focus of the federal government has really been on increasing the flow of data without thought of what happens to the provider on the receiving end of that data that is often not relevant or actionable or, contains duplicate 200-page CCDA. We're seeing some institutions that have a lot of money spending time developing algorithms and machine learning to try and process that and identify the knowledge within there. But, facilities and practices with less resources don't have that capability. Where does this fit in?
So, Rachel, it's Blackbird. I'd be happy to jump in. Sarah, I did share on the chat a link to the PDF you've probably seen about the HHS, ONC, CMS document that refers to their strategy on how to reduce physician burden, reducing the burden of use of health IT and EHR. And it is just a great litany of all the problems and possible ways in which we might mitigate some of the issues. I think this is centrally one of the ways we can reduce physician burden by improving access to and use of, at least in the clinical context, again, the purview here is broader, but at least in the clinical context, facilitating data flow and knowledge flow in a way that is much more supportive of clinical care. Anyway, you've probably seen that PDF.
So there's a lot of questions, and I have to go in about 90 seconds. So I thought I'd very quickly chime in and try to begin an answer of the question of how do we select use cases. And I think that identifying criteria for selecting use cases is going to be a challenge and going to be something that we're going to have to get a group together and figure out. But in particular, we want use cases that are going to demonstrate what we're trying to figure out here. And that are practical and pragmatic and either being implemented now or planning to be implemented in the very near future, not just theoretically use cases for 2 years or 5 years from now. I'm sure there will be a lot more criteria, but hopefully some of you will think about joining the technical infrastructure group to help us figure out how to do that.
Great, thank you, Chris. Any other co-chairs have a comment on that? And if not, I'll close. No, I think you summed it up well. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining and remind you that the recording of this webinar and a summary of the questions and some answers that we will even articulate a more formal response to will be available on the website in the future. Please do complete the survey. Follow the link. It's a very quick survey to sign up to be a part of one of these groups reach out to us if you've got particular questions or concerns or resources. And then I'll encourage you to save the date of July 18th and 19th if you're available for our next in-person meeting, and we will delve into these issues in much more depth then. So again, thank you all for joining. I wish you a happy holiday and happy new year, and we look forward to sharing more information about our accomplishments and thoughts on this in the coming year.